Today on the Hobby Bench, I'll be painting up the Punisher for Marvel Crisis Protocol. So today I'll be painting up the Punisher, and to lay down a base coat first starting off, I'm going to be using Greasy Black. Now, it can be a little deceptive because you look at, something like this, a costume that he'd be wearing or his uniform, be a single color, pretty easy to work with, but sometimes it's a little hard to bring out a lot of depth and shading, especially if you're using something as opaque as black. That's why I decided to use Greasy Black initially. I like it. It adds a little more depth than you typically would with maybe some of the other contrast paints, especially Hospitality or Black. This has, I would say, almost a gray undercoat for some of the upper portions of that. So it adds a little more depth. And I just wanted to see sort of how it would look, if this would just be enough working with it. And it does, give a good foundation. So typically, like a lot of just the Vallejo Express contrast paints I'm working with, it's undiluted. And I'm just going through one section at a time pretty carefully. And you can see, how it's just covering. It covers pretty well. I think as a gray or as a black goes, it's pretty good. And here you see the final results. And as I mentioned, definitely in those nooks and crannies, it's black. It's got that chalky, dark color. But in those upper portions, it's a little bit gray. And I thought, well, maybe it's a little bit too much. So I'm going to quickly use a black ink to just give it one quick wash. And this is really going to help define the cracks and crevices and little nooks and crannies within his uniform and really bring out that black and just cover over those other areas just to give it a little bit more of a black tone. So I'm just going to work through the miniature here using that black ink and give it the look I think it needs to get. Now that I got his uniform done, I'm going to be moving on and working on his skin. And for that, I'm going to be using Dark Flesh as the base coat. And it's a pretty nice coat, pretty opaque acrylic paint here. So I'm just going to give him one coat and just carefully go through it, trying not to get all stuff all over his uniform, and just give it a very simple coat. And I like this paint. It's got a nice little darker color. It definitely leaves a good foundation for skin tones, like a lot. So here you go. I've got that skin tone done, so that sort of lays it down. Now, he's got some muscles and stuff. It's a little hard to pick out. So what I'm going to be using here is just giving a thin wash of sepia ink. And that's just to add a tad more depth to it and also make it a little bit easier for me to paint doing the highlights and just sort of maybe get a little bit more definition in some of his muscles and stuff, really so I can pick that out a little bit more. It's hard, especially because you have this lighter undercoat, to sort of see where those cuts in his muscle are and a little bit on his face. And so this sepia ink will leave a really nice foundation, bring out that detail. And I'm just carefully going through that in his face. You can get hollow out in his eyes and really work through that. Just carefully going through his hand. You can sort of bring out a little bit more into details on his fingers. And of course, definitely moving on to his muscles too and using that. Now I've got that finished up. You can see it's got a really nice look in that. So now I'm going to be working on the highlight of his muscles. And for it, I'm going to be using basic skin tone and also using Dark Flesh as a mix 1-to-1 for those. Basic skin tone is a great pink, but it's a little bit too light. So I wanted to darken it out a little bit. And for here then, what I'm basically going to do is just sort of look at the highlights of his muscle, and it's pretty thinned out, and just, really try to bring out a little bit more of his definition in those areas that would catch a lot of light. And just add some more gradation of color there. And just really carefully work through this here. Less is more. That's the way to do it. Try to get it a little thinned out. You can always go back to sections again and just give it another coat. And here I'm just carefully going through areas on his arms, on his face, a little bit on his hands, and really try to bring the skin tone out. It's pretty good right now just using simple wash. That works pretty well. But I really want to add just a little bit more color depth to that. So I'm going to be using these highlights to sort of go through and work my way through that. So I've got the foundation of his skin down, and it really has the gradations of color that I wanted. So it's just light enough, just dark enough. And now I'm going to be looking at his costume. And for that, I'm going to be using dark blue gray. You know, it's a little deceptive sometimes when you work with these colors, especially as something like as black. You figure, oh, I'll just paint it black. Well, you know, really on the tabletop, it's just not going to stand out. So you need to try to do something to bring out some of those highlights. And this can be really tricky with that. But I sort of like this color as black. It's a really dark gray. You know, in some points, you know, just want to put a little bit more to try to catch that highlight and just give that model, you know, some depth to it. And so I'm just going to try to go through pretty light dry brush here and impart that gray color over that. And you know, some areas are going to go back and maybe just give it another coat of black, just to sort of maybe add a tad more contrast between those two colors. But I find really, you know, it's not going to hack it if you're just going to be working with that. And so there you go. I've got that done. I worked through that gray in there, and just to get some more depth to his costume. So now I'm going to be working on his hair, and of course the classic Punisher icon on his chest, and even a little detonator that he's holding. And so for those, I'm going to go back to some simple acrylic colors. Just give those base shades. I'm going to be using a neutral for the detonator. I'll be using black, of course, for his hair, and so I'll fill in some detail a little bit. And then I'll finally go back to using white for that classic, the Punisher icon that he has on his chest. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time just showing you all the times I've messed up working on that icon on his chest, getting the skull icon. It's a little tough, especially trying to get the piping down. And so I use black to sort of fill that in a bit. And I also want to point out in his detonator, there's a little button there. And just to give it some color, I added just red to that. You know, just a small little detail to bring that out. And you probably would miss it normally. So there you go. You know, I got his hair painted up. I've got the skull painted up in his chest. Just a simple white color. A little bit of black in there on the edges of that. I also use a little bit of black ink again, going back on his gun, just to give it a little bit more depth in there and sort of fill in some of those darker crevices in his rifle, bring that out a bit. Now for Frank, you know, I don't know. I like the classic idea of Frank having a 5 o'clock shadow. So for that, I'm going to be using dark blue gray again. And this time I'm going to be using glaze medium. And just to try to really have a thin, transparent color. You know, if you probably just used a wash, the thing is that you're going to have, you know, basically a really dark color get down and, like, you know, maybe the cracks of his neck or around his nose and stuff. To avoid that, I'm going to be using this glaze medium, and that really helps make it very transparent. And so basically you're just going to use the acrylic paint and then use the glaze medium to thin it out. And I'm just going to go ahead and carefully go through like where I think his beard would be to give him that 5 o'clock shadow. And you know, the glaze medium, it takes a long time to dry. You're just going to probably want to give it maybe a couple coats. And you know, this, you just need to be patient with this. But I think, you know, this small little detail that sort of helps bring it out. It's a little bit more tricky to work with, but I think the end result will hopefully be pretty good. As you can see here, I'm just putting it on, and you can already see it's pretty thin. It's pretty transparent, and that's the idea of that glaze medium. It's just to impart some color to it, but still be enough to see that base skin tone underneath it. And just working through that pretty carefully. And there you go. And it just took about 2 or 3 coats. It takes a long time to dry in between that, but you know, that's what you had for the working with it. Now for the base, I wanted to like have this stand out a little bit more. And so, you know, he's a black uniform, so I want to impart some color, but not make it stand out too much. So for there, I actually broke out and used the Games Workshop Nazdreg Yellow contrast. You know, it's just for a base. I don't care. I'm going to use that for terrain. And I just use some nameless craft paint as a dry brush. And there you go. And I like that. I think when I give, if I just had it all gray, you know, yeah, that would probably look gray or black for asphalt. But, you know, he's got a black uniform or a black costume. You know, I want to like make it, give a little bit of color, something a little bit more subtle. I think this does the job. And there you go. You know, that's the Punisher. And I wish I had the piping a little bit more cleaner on his chest, but I'm pretty happy with him. And, you know, I love the beard, the 5 o'clock shadow. I mean, to me, that's classic Frank Castle right there. And I think he looks pretty good. Can't wait to get him on the tabletop.